Thank you for joining us for another episode of Baker Hosts Ad Nauseam, a podcast series focusing on new and trending advertising issues with an emphasis on the FTC and the NAD. I'm Randall Rubin King, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. We are once again joined by amudge and Daniel Kaufman, two partners from BakerHostetler's advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Together, they have decades of advertising experience and approach advertising issues from multiple perspectives. On today's episode of Ad Nauseam, Amy and Daniel are back with special guest Randy Shaheen, a fellow partner at BakerHostetler, to discuss the passing of the FTC's new junk fees rule. With that, welcome to Ad Nauseam, and let's turn it over to Amy, Daniel, and Randy.
Welcome back to Ad Nauseam. We are well into the beginning of 2025, and change is certainly afoot. Kind of surprisingly, we have a new FTC rule to talk about. We've teased it up before, but now it's actually here. The FTC's rule on junk fees. But more importantly, we have a guest joining us today, Mr., or should I say Professor Randy Shaheen. Thank you for joining us. We're so happy to have you here with me and with Daniel. But hey, before we dive in, how was everybody's holidays?
So it's nice to see you both. Hope you all had a great holiday. It was fun to have all of my now 20 something plus kids home for at least a few days, and we didn't have a white Christmas here in DC, but at least as we look out our windows, we have a white New Year. So that was nice.
Thanks, Randy, and it is great to have you here. I did not have a white Christmas either. I spent much of the holidays in Vegas at the Fontainebleau Hotel, the new place there, which was really, really quite nice.
I bet you had a red Christmas then, Daniel, if you're out there gambling. I don't know about that.
Gambling shows, yeah.
Now, wait a minute, Daniel. Hanukkah was the same day, right? Started the same day as Christmas. Did you get some Chinese food and movies out in Vegas, or were you just at the tables, my friend?
I would say a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, but had a great time. Yeah.
I love that is your holiday tradition, hitting Vegas. Little known fact about Daniel Kaufman. If you ever want to get him at a conference or anywhere else, just ask him to Vegas.
It's an easy. How were your holidays, Amy?
It was family. It was wonderful. And, lots of cooking, lots of shenanigans, playing family games as opposed to craps and blackjack. But it was really nice to take a little bit of time off and kind of unwind. But so now we're going to talk about those junk fees and, not to bury the lead, but it was kind of exciting. The rule, what it did show up, it just applies to hotels and to live ticket events. That was a huge change from what was proposed. We've talked a lot about concerts on Ad Nauseam in the past because Daniel and I love to go to concerts, but we really haven't talked about hotels. So first, let me ask you guys, any memorable hotel experiences you have that are worth sharing?
First trip to Europe I made many years ago, and I'll never forget. In London, I was at a B&B. I was all excited. It looked lovely. My view literally had a room of the B&B's laundry room. So throughout the stay, it also smelled like a laundry room. So I just always have remembered that room, just overlooking not the Thames, but the
Daniel, your glass
room.
is always half empty. You were in London, for goodness sake. Randy, what about you?
I think my most memorable experience when I was an associate at another law firm. For those of you who know DC, there's a hotel in DC called the Willard, which was a classic old hotel that was shut down for quite a while and then reopened. But I was staying really late for a work project, and I decided just to stay in town. And I went to book a room at the Willard, and the woman said to me, "You know what? There's no one using the presidential suite. I'll just give it to you for a regular room rate if you want." So I said, "Sure," and walked in, and it was amazing. And I called some friends and were like, "Hey, come hang with me." And we had takeout dinner on this ginormous table.
That is awesome. Well, I have nothing. I have no status anywhere. I stay where it's the cheapest, where it's the easiest. I do love when I travel with Randy, and it's quite often that we do because he has super rock star status at Marriott. So whenever I travel with him, they treat me very, what is it, like titanium something or other you've got. But I will say that's what loyalty gets you, right? And kudos to you for that.
So We did get a December surprise from the FTC. Amy teed it up. We've got the FTC junk fees rule, and there is a lot to talk about regarding what's in the rule, what isn't in the rule. And Randy, as our special guest, do you want to set the stage for us?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. So, I mean, as things go in government and at the FTC, this all happened, I think relatively fast. So back in October 2023, the FTC issued a proposed junk fee rule, and this was clearly something the Biden administration was pushing. The White House tweeted about it a few times, and so maybe the issuing of this was also kind of a last minute gift to the outgoing administration. But the initial rule would have covered pretty much all industries and products, right? There were a few exemptions. I think auto dealers, because they were already subject to a different rule, were potentially being carved out. But really, it would have covered pretty much all commerce, and would have tremendously impacted how prices are advertised, and restricted the ability of pretty much all companies to advertise prices without including mandatory fees. And not surprisingly, there was a huge amount of interest in the proposed rule. There were, I think at last count, something like 60,000 comments filed. A lot of them were from consumers, right? People are complaining their concert tickets cost too much, but there were also a lot of substantive concerns about the scope of the proposal. A lot of industries weighing in, saying it just didn't make sense for them for a lot of different reasons, including sometimes how fees were imposed or assessed. And then the FTC kind of went dark for a while. And then we had the election, the impending transition to a new FTC, new administration. And, we all knew the FTC was doing an awful lot of things, trying to get a lot out the door, and didn't think this was necessarily going to be one of the things that made it over the transom before the new administration. But they did it. They announced the final rule in December, 4-1 vote. So they did get one Republican. Commissioner Holyoke voted for it. She voted yes. And Commissioner Ferguson, I suspect Chair Ferguson, by the time this makes it to print, will be the chair. He voted no.
Well, and the FTC's press release made a really big deal of the fact that there was bipartisan support for the rule. And, it touted in the header that quote, the FTC Federal Trade Commission announces bipartisan rule banning junk ticket and hotel fees. And, a couple thoughts there. Frankly, that headline is somewhat deceptive. But also, second, that bipartisan support was really crucial here. And although I suppose we'll say then Commissioner, probably now by the time this is airing, Chair Ferguson dissented, his dissent really focused on the timing, not on the substance of the rule. And he reserved comment about the substance of the rule, but he did note that it was a significant improvement over what the commission originally, I think he said, threatened to inflict on the American economy.
He does have a turn of phrase there on occasion in his statements. But look, getting Commissioner Holyoke on board was really key here. And it certainly makes it a lot more likely that this rule will be a keeper. As we know, sort of lots of rules are getting challenged. This one hasn't been challenged yet. And her statement made it very clear that she was deeply concerned by the initial proposed rule, and that the subsequent narrowing of the rule was both appropriate and, as she says, she quotes, the final rule now has sufficient flexibility to allow for lawful advertising and practices. But being able to get that bipartisan support here, really key.
Yeah, and Amy, I think you make a good point about the headlines. And there's certainly been lots of articles saying that, junk fees in these two industries are gone. And part of it, I think, goes back to what the commission, how the commission marketed this, right? Talking about all these fees as junk fees. Well, who would want industry to be able to impose junk fees? But in reality, some of these fees are, shipping and handling is not a junk fee necessarily. It's a real charge, or delivery fees. That's a real cost. So to say they're gone is really a stretch. The fees aren't gone. It's just that those selling live event tickets or hotels can continue to charge those fees. They just have to include the fees in the initial advertised price. It's all in pricing. And so hopefully you should no longer get the surprise add-on fees at the end, where you see the ticket advertised at $35 and you go to check out and there's another $25 in added fees. So the fees aren't gone. They're just going to be folded into the price you see advertised.
The rule is limited to these two areas, tickets and hotels. But, let's face it, these are the areas where we've heard the most public concern being raised about such fees. And, to be clear, hotels are viewed as short term lodging and will include all those other platforms where you can book short term stays. But so, what does the rule require? Well, any additional fees or charges imposed, which would presumably be non mandatory fees, must be disclosed before payment with an explanation of the nature, purpose, and amount of the fee. The rule also includes a provision prohibiting misleading fees. Now, that may or may not cover overstating the actual cost to the seller of the fee itself. In addition, the rule does not preempt state laws unless they're inconsistent with the rule, and specifically notes that providing greater protections is not inconsistent with this rule.
So let's be really clear here. This was an enormous win
Mhm.
for the other industries that were all really deeply concerned about, the proposed rule and how it was really going to constrain how they advertise pricing going forward. I mean, really huge to have this change. Randy, how did we end up here?
So yeah, I mean, it definitely was a huge win, and we had a very happy client in a different industry that we submitted comments for that was happy to be excluded. There's a very long Federal Register notice that goes into all the why and therefores. Commissioner Holyoke made it clear that she doesn't necessarily endorse or agree with a lot of what is in the Federal Register notice, but basically that notice says that although there's substantial evidence that would support broader coverage of the rule, the Commission elects to use its rulemaking authority incrementally. That's an unusual thing for this Commission, by first combating these unfair and deceptive practices in the two industries in which the Commission first began evaluating drip pricing and that have a history of bait and switch pricing tactics and misleading fees. So essentially, I think the Commission made a strategic decision to go narrow, hopefully avoid any legal challenge. And if they do get one, I think the likelihood of success goes up because they didn't have a lot of economic analysis or support kind of outside of those two areas.
So, and of course, the Federal Register notice also explains why, again, in the Commission's views, all of the other concerns that were raised by the earlier proposed rule were invalid. And there were a lot of issues raised in industry comments, including that the proposal violated the First Amendment by restricting truthful commercial speech, that it, constituted a major question and was subject to that doctrine, that it was inconsistent with the agency's rulemaking authority, and that it was arbitrary and capricious and violated the Administrative Procedures Act.
Well, so obviously, this is a sea change for some ticketing and hotel players, although it's worth noting that many in those industries were already in compliance and had started including those fees in its advertised prices. But for everyone else, well, Chair Khan, not shockingly, had a strong message in the press release. And she said she urges enforcers to continue cracking down on these unlawful fees and encourage state and federal policymakers to build on this success with legislation that bans unfair and deceptive junk fees across the economy.
Yeah, and I think there's really two issues that get raised here that I think companies have to really think about. First, we're seeing some states take up, and really even before Chair Khan made this statement, states that had begun to pass similar junk fee laws. But for the most extent, those state laws are broader than where the FTC eventually landed. I mean, they were initially about as broad as the FTC's proposed rule, but the FTC narrowed it. And so you've got to keep up with state developments. I think, too, in particular, you've got California's law that went into effect earlier last year, and kind of a last minute legislative win for the restaurant industry. They actually got exempted from the law, although there's still requirements about disclosing the fees in a clear and conspicuous manner. But the California law is otherwise much broader. And then a Minnesota law just went into effect that also is very broad. It has some unique carve outs with respect to things like variable fees or delivery fees. But again, its coverage is much broader than the FTC's rule. And then the other thing to remember is we have a junk fee rule, but we've still got the FTC Act, right? And the FTC Act applies to, to essentially all commerce. And so the FTC can still bring enforcement actions involving a broad range of pricing issues, no matter what the industry is. So, for those cases, civil penalties won't be in play because there's no rule coverage. But the FTC has certainly, negotiated for redress in a lot of matters where a range of different fees were not adequately disclosed to consumers.
Yeah, we have definitely seen a lot of cases involving a whole range of different fees that were imposed and challenged, particularly in connection with auto dealerships. That's been a particularly hot topic for the FTC over the last couple of years. Also, just a few months ago, the FTC announced it was a $48 million settlement against Invitation Homes in connection with a range of practices, including a variety of allegedly hidden fees in the context of apartment rentals. So the FTC is always going to be a backstop here, and we're going to absolutely see a continued range of actions in a wide variety of industries going forward, I would think.
And Randy, you and I have worked on many FTC cases over the years involving various and sundry pricing issues. So, how about you wrap things up with some helpful pointers for our listeners when we think about some key pricing issues?
Sure. And I can remember Amy saying to people, I think we even wrote an article on this, about when it comes to like deceptive pricing, the FTC just isn't viewing that as a priority. And I think that's probably still true when it comes to your kind of plain vanilla sale pricing stuff, although the states and the class action lawyers certainly care about that. But we have seen the FTC get much more active on other types of pricing issues. So I think there's a few key things to keep in mind when you're talking about pricing and advertising. So first, consistent with the junk fee rule, if you're talking about mandatory costs and fees, be upfront about those, right? Even if you aren't in the hotel or ticketing industry, consumers and regulators aren't going to be happy when consumers first learn about those fees at the end of a transaction. And then second, when you advertise prices, do it accurately, right? If a low price is only available to a small number of consumers, right, there are still rules around advertising a super low price or starting at price, but the availability of that is extremely limited. You've got to be very careful in how you describe that price and how you describe the range. If there are limitations or restrictions about the price you're promoting, for example, there was an FTC case involving a starting at price, but only a limited number of people qualified for that price. And the FTC came back and said, you've got to disclose those restrictions upfront and ahead of time. When you're charging additional fees, make sure you're accurately describing the purpose and amount of those fees. As Amy mentioned, that could be deceptive under Section 5 or potentially even under the new rule. And then don't forget about the states, right? More states will probably join California and Minnesota, hopefully not with a lot of kind of patchwork, inconsistent laws, but you've got to be careful about the state laws and junk fees and pricing. And finally, if you are in the hotel or ticketing industry, pay real close attention to this rule. There will probably be more guidance that comes out, maybe some warning letters or enforcement eventually. It's likely sticking around, we think. It's hard to predict, but it seems like this one, unlike some of the other rules, might stick. And the penalties for violations are significant. We think, absent some last minute court activity, that the rule is likely to become effective sometime this spring.
Well, Randy, thank you very much for those pointers. And everybody, hope you had a wonderful holiday season. And thank you for joining us here on Ad Nauseam.
Thank you, Amy, Daniel, and Randy. If you have any questions for Amy, Daniel, or Randy, their contact information is in the show notes. For more information on the latest developments in ad law, visit our Adventures in Law blog at www.adventures-in-law.com and check out all Ad Nauseam episodes by subscribing to Baker Hosts wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.